I've never voted for a Democrat.
Wow.
And it tells you, I think, the stakes in this election.
Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. It's no news that Donald Trump lies about big things, small things, domestic things, international things, medicine, money, and math. It's by now a baked-in non-story as old as the ride down the escalator. Except the lies are still repugnant and dangerous. And in the closing weeks of a presidential campaign in which both sides are attempting to persuade undecided voters that the other candidate is an existential danger for the country, we can't ignore the risk that Trump's shameless whoppers will be credited by 1% of voters and ignored by the rest. J.D. Vance did his running mate proud with a skillful debate performance. He was a softer, gentler Vance, but stumbled at the finish line, unable to choke out the words that Trump lost the 2020 election. But the most memorable few hours of the political week came in Kamala Harris's campaign, where she was joined on stage by Liz Cheney, a former Republican icon who averred that she never has voted for a Democrat in her life, but that the stakes for democracy in 2024 are transcendent. And Trump's long, successful run of keeping the public from learning the details of Jack Smith's case against him for schemes to steal the 2020 election came to an abrupt end. Judge Tanya Chutkan unsealed Smith's 180-page chapter and verse account of Trump's alleged misdeeds. But whether the incendiary revelations had any impact on any undecided voter, whoever and wherever they may be, was far from clear. To take stock of one of the most mendacious weeks in American political history and consider whether any of the events moved a critical slice of the electorate, we welcome three powerhouse analysts who know the political arena inside and out. And they are Alisyn Camerota, a journalist, author, anchor, and correspondent for CNN throughout her 3 decades in journalism. Alisyn has covered stories around the world and earned 2 Emmy Awards in the process. Her latest book is Combat Love. So good to welcome you back to Talking Feds, Alisyn.
Great to be here with you guys.
You want to give a sentence or two on Combat Love?
Well, I mean, it's the best book since Huckleberry Finn.
Best record since Combat Rock.
Many people are saying that. Many people are saying that.
Yeah, there's a lot of combat rock in it. And if you are a Gen Xer, if you know anything about the Jersey Shore, if you like music, if you want to hear how I became this monster, read Combat Love.
There you go. And really, who doesn't fill one of those 4 categories?
Precisely.
David French, an opinion columnist with the New York Times, a former JAG officer deployed to Iraq in 2007. He earned a Bronze Star with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. A prominent conservative voice, David writes regularly about the country's growing polarization, most notably in his book, Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. Thank you for your service, and thank you for rejoining Talking Feds.
Thanks for having me back. I always enjoy it.
And Norm Ornstein, an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a contributing editor for The Atlantic, and co-host of the sophisticated and fun podcast Words Matter with Kavita Patel. He's a prolific author and most notably co-wrote the bestseller with the long title, but I'll do the whole thing, One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. And not least, he's a Talking Feds MVP that our audience can't seem to get enough of. Norm Ornstein, thanks as always for joining.
Thank you, Harry. And Alisyn, I think it's the best book since the Trump Bible.
There you go. And it's under $100, right? It's a great deal.
If you befriend Ryan Walter, the education head in Oklahoma, he might send $3.3 million in their taxpayer money to you to purchase the book, as he did with the Trump Bible.
I'll write down his email right now, Norm.
Yes.
There you go. And there's got to be some Hurricane Helene money in it for Alisyn, don't you think? Biden and Harris will be doling it out somehow. Okay. All right. So pick a lie, any lie. It really has been an amazingly fib-filled week for the former president. But let me just serve it up. Give me your, favorite lie and why it is your favorite, what it sort of illustrates about the state of the campaign and Trump, and what you think is really significant about it.
I don't know if it was this week. They all blend together. But my favorite, because it's such an illustration of where we are, is the immigrants eating pets. It didn't start this week, but it continues to have legs, and they continue to repeat it. And the reason that it's my favorite is because it's demonstrably false. It's absurd on its face. J.D. Vance said to Dana Bash out loud, I'm willing to create stories. So it's a bald-faced lie. And yet it's not a harmless lie. It's not just fun and games. It's hurting people. It's threatening their lives. It's taking the incredible resources and sweat equity of the community of Springfield to try to counter this. And the police have to investigate threats, and people have to board up their storefronts that they think, because they're getting threats of violence. And so it's been acknowledged that it's completely malicious. And yeah, okay, it serves their purpose, I guess, in instilling fear, but it's so awful. I mean, that's all of those reasons are such kind of inhumane motivations that I can't believe that they're willing to just say it out loud, that that's what they're actually doing.
Sets the bar pretty high, Norm and David, but that's right. 33 bomb threats, xenophobia against what apparently has been a pretty productive community in Springfield, and all the eloquent things Alisyn said. Other favorite lies out there?
This is so difficult because
I know. But that's what Talking Feds and you three are about, right? The hard choices.
I'm going to do like the Academy Awards, but I'm going to give 3 contenders. The first one was Trump accepting a Purple Heart. This is a guy who, of course, not only got out of the Vietnam War with phony bone spurs, but went on Howard Stern and said his Vietnam was avoiding sexually transmitted diseases. So I guess he gets the Purple Heart because he got some sexually transmitted diseases. The second is J.D. Vance refusing to answer on the debate the question about whether Biden won the election, and the next day saying Trump won the election. But the top one, and this follows on what Alisyn said, was the lie about FEMA, first of all, stealing money, which is what he did. But just as in Springfield, the lies about what's happened in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene will kill people. These are pro-life people who will do anything, even if it results in deaths, if it gives them some kind of political advantage. And when Trump did this, it signaled every one of his acolytes and cultists to do the same thing, including what may be a real contender with Trump for the worst liar, Elon Musk.
And can I just add a gloss on this? You did say Trump did it, but it's more than that and more Trumpian than that. He took the money and wanted to withhold it from states that didn't politically support him in a disaster and wanted to dole it out and more to people who did. David, you're probably feeling the pressure about now.
Oh, I don't feel any pressure because there's so many to choose from that. Let me go with 13,000 immigrant murderers roaming free in America. One of the things you have to say about this, though, is it's never just Trump. Every one of these things has been picked up and amplified by multiple voices in MAGA America, by virtually every MAGA news outlet. So if it was just Trump, it'd be really bad, but you would feel like it was more manageable. But it's not just Trump. It's when Trump says something or when he picks something up from Twitter and then amplifies it, everyone runs with it. And this 13,000 murderers running free was remarkable. The gullibility that it takes to believe that there are 13,000 known murderers that are running free from, in some versions of the lie that say came in during the Biden administration. This is referring to murders and crimes dating back 40 years And because they didn't understand that the term non-detained meant not detained by ICE, it didn't mean not detained at all. But all of this is easy to figure out. Like if you see a number that feels wild and weird, one of the first things you do is you research it for 5 seconds, right? Similarly with the Hurricane Helene stuff. If you see something where some guy is claiming to be a member of the Florida State Guard and claiming that all of these things have happened, that he's aware of deep conspiracies in the North Carolina state government, and he's aware of the military withholding you think, how does this guy know all of this stuff? What is the basis for this information? But what happens is MAGA will hear something that casts Biden in a bad light or manufacture something that casts Biden in a bad light, and then they just run with it. They just run with it. And here's the other thing that happens. They run with it, and then when you come in 5 minutes later with the most basic fact check, they're furious at you for the cover-up. And it's absolutely extraordinary. And part of this is extremely dangerous for democracy. And also part of this is walling off this MAGA community from the whole rest of America because everyone else is not so deep in that conspiracy mindset. They're just kind of walling themselves off, living in an alternative reality. And it's harmful to the country. It's harmful to them, quite frankly, to live and marinate in all of those lies. And it's just sad.
I want to cede the field to all of you for the very reason David just said, but I just want to give a little asterisk to the Jamie Dimon line because it's got this great feature of being incredibly easy to fact check. Like somebody called up Jamie Dimon, oh no, I haven't endorsed Donald Trump. And then it's also, I love Trump's response, which was pretty much the same as with Katz in Springfield. Oh really? Well, I don't know. Somebody put it up. That was actually the basis that he had advanced it. But this is sort of serious, even though there's comic value. So let me move to what David was just saying. Let's think about this in as sophisticated analysis as we can muster in terms of what's going on now, where the votes are, and the margins of winning and losing. So here's one cynical, but maybe accurate vantage point, which is all the quaint voters who are offended by these brazen and harmful lies. None of them's going to vote for Trump anyway. He is indifferent to all of this. Others, of course, would say, man, you've got a very tight election. You're finding people who we don't know who they're going to vote yet learning this stuff. You would think it would really tip them to one side or another. So just thoughts about why he continues, and is it logical in some sense, or what about the actual impact?
I can't imagine what the actual impact is because I think it's so baked in right now that people, that for the slice of people who are undecided, I don't know if they decide on lies. I don't know what motivates them.
I would say there are a couple of things. The first is he has a floor of about 45%. I'd say a ceiling of 47 to 48, which is maybe being generous, although not to the American people.
That's true.
The question is who turns out. And all of this is aimed at angering his base into believing that the other side is utterly evil and you all have to turn out to keep the country from becoming even more of a hellscape. That's a part of it. The second part of it is, and I use this almost every day, what Mary McCarthy said about Lillian Hellman. Every word out of his mouth, including a and the, is a lie. He can't help himself. I think that goes back to childhood. But there's another element to this, which is that you deaden the public to what is true, what is false, and no sense of shame about it. So, Marco Rubio tweets out, and the one thing that he said that was really true is little Marco tweets out that the jobs numbers all throughout this administration are phony and have been baked in, and it's utterly false, and it's slimy, but there's now a green light to do stuff like this, including from people who, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, know better. Tim Sheehy is the Republican candidate for the Senate in Montana against John Tester. And as of today, Sheehy is winning. He has lied about just about everything. But in the debate that he had, he talked about how when he came out of the military, he was at the poverty level, when in his memoir, he said he had $400,000 at that point. And he lies about everything, and it doesn't affect a vote. Once you start down a path of saying you can lie and there are no consequences, then everybody joins in. And it's deadened the culture. The other thing I refer to almost every day is Pat Moynihan's defining deviancy down. Lying used to be a serious offense. We have defined it down enough now that you can lie and then you can lie again. I watch Scott Jennings. He lies. Sometimes he's called out. Does it stop him? Does he step back in his role as a commentator and say, gee, maybe I should tone it down a little bit? No, because there are no consequences for it. And that's just one example among hundreds, if not more.
And just a quick factual gloss. The Good Jobs Report, they deny it, or they say, actually, there have been new jobs, all taken up by immigrant murderers. That's who got all the new jobs.
After January 6th, I wrote a piece where I talked about the difference between enabling lies and activating lies. So enabling lies are sort of the big background sweeping assertions about their opponents that the far right engages in all the time. You know, so in radical Christian circles, they'll call Democrats democrats, or they'll say that Kamala Harris is used as witchcraft, or she's under the influence of the occult. And then in more secular conservative circles, you'll hear woke mind virus, and you'll hear all of these allegations. They hate you. They hate America. And so for years and years and years, the soil was being tilled to believe outrageous things, right? So once you've convinced people that your opponents are less than human, that they're under the influence of demons, for example, you will believe anything about them. Withholding aid to kill red state of Americans? Sure, demons will do that. Set 13,000 murder migrants free in the interior of the country to kill Americans? Yeah, that sounds pretty demonic to me. Importing people are going to kill and eat cats? Sure, that's exactly what the woke mind virus will lead to. And so what we're dealing with is actually this very fertile soil that was created for these very specific lies. They don't work. Those very specific lies don't work if you have a healthy mindset to begin with. They just bounce off of you like you have a suit of armor on. But if you have a very unhealthy view of the world that has been cultivated carefully over a period of sometimes decades, depending on the news outlets you've been listening to, then you will fall for anything. And the more negative the story, ironically enough, the easier it is to believe. Because a slightly negative story doesn't fit the demonic narrative, right? It doesn't fit the woke mind virus narrative. But the big, sweeping, vicious story, now that fits what you've been told about your opponent. Steal an election? Sure. That's minor compared to some of the things they think they're capable of. And I can remember the seeds for this being planted all the way back in the 90s. Some of you may remember VHS tapes being mailed out to a bunch of homes, the Clinton body count sort of conspiracy. So the seeds for this have been planted for a really, really long time.
You know, I just want to say one thing about all of this, which is back to the critical thinking that David French was talking about. The funny thing about this era that we live in right now is that there's this fire hose of misinformation and disinformation coming at us in a way that never did before. So it is hard for normal people to discern what's true, what's not true. This sounds legitimate. This looks like a legitimate website. Is it? It's harder. But on the flip side, it's also easier than ever with, as David said, a 5-second Google search to fact check things. So all you need to have is a minor curiosity about something that sounds too weird to be true or too demonic to be true. And you can fact check it like that. But because they've been groomed in the MAGA world to eat up these conspiracy theories and the negativity bias of it and the conspiracy theory bias that we're all parts of our brain are all titillated by, they don't bother doing it. And so Marco Rubio, he knows that numbers are adjusted. I mean, that's the thing that the germ of truth is that sometimes a jobs report comes out and then later the numbers are adjusted down. Sometimes they're adjusted up. He doesn't mention that part. So he knows that. But like Norm said, he has permission now not to be a critical thinker. He has permission now to say whatever he wants and knows that people won't be doing that fact checking.
You think of autocracies as nations where the press is totally controlled and they will go with the program. But even if you have a nation where the press isn't controlled, does its job, but 45, 47, 48 literally don't listen to them or go or just see them as part of the deep state. Man, what a quandary for the press in its traditional role of trying to speak the truth. It feels like that you're in quicksand, and, it just seems from the standpoint of the press, a kind of insoluble puzzle.
I mean, we're in a very, very, very challenging time. I believe the press's job, one of our main compacts with our viewers, is to fact check. I want to still be the place where you can go and say, is it true? Here's what CNN says. And I believe that fact checking, but it is very hard to fact check because everything we've talked about, the MAGA Republicans lie with such frequency. It is very hard to stop every interview. Excuse me, I need to fact check that right now. Excuse me, stop, next sentence. Let me fact check that. Excuse me, let me pull up this graphic. That is hard to do in real time.
Well, and the other thing that makes it difficult is they will tell you, let's say you're interviewing a Republican and they lie 10 times, and you're interviewing a Democrat and they say one thing that's wrong. They'll say, why are you fact checking 10 to 1? Look at the bias, 10 fact checks to 1.
Or they lie too, look at the one.
Right. Well, look at that one lie. Our 10 are not a problem. I mean, that's constant. That's absolutely constant. And the other thing that's occurring is when I was researching my book about American divisions, I talked to a really fascinating person who was an expert in sort of the psychology of conflict. And one of the things that she told me that was fascinating is that when you're a deeply, deeply committed partisan, like you're all in, when you encounter a negative fact, I'm not talking about a negative argument or an angry person, a negative fact, your body reacts with an involuntary fight or flight response. That the encounter of negative facts, and when I say negative facts, I mean the facts that contradict your arguments, people have an involuntary negative anger response to that. And so it makes it that much more difficult because literally their body is telling them something is wrong with you, with the person fact checking them, because they were comfortable before, they felt certain before, and now you're confronting them with something that breaks open or breaks apart part of their worldview. It's almost involuntary. Now, rational human beings should be able to fight through their feelings. A famous conservative said, facts don't care about your feelings. But it turns out that MAGA feelings trump facts all day, every day. And this is a reality we're dealing with, and we have to figure out a way to reach people through the feelings because the facts, ironically enough, are making them so angry, they're making the problem worse.
So the tweet of the day was, nurse, get on the scale. Response, you said there would be no fact checking. But it's not just the 10 on one side and 1 on the other, it's unfair. It's that they know the natural response of mainstream media is going to be to provide balance. So it's always both-sided. And so what we've seen is now a ton of stories about Tim Walz saying that he was in Hong Kong when Tiananmen Square happened, when actually 36 years ago, he didn't go until August, and it happened a couple of months earlier. And his response, although it was word salad in the debate, which is understandable, when I got to Hong Kong, it was all about the democracy challenge and I conflated things. It's not true, but to equate that with J.D. Vance saying that the Haitians are eating dogs and cats and killing geese and putting everybody in Springfield on alert because they might be attacked or killed.
And by the way, I just made that all up for its story value.
Yeah, but to equate those two things is malpractice, I believe. They work the refs and they succeed over and over again. So that adds to the reality that they know there aren't going to be consequences for this.
All right, we've got the perfect segue now because I did want to spend some time on the vice presidential debate and its aftermath, where I think in terms of what we're talking about, J.D. Vance proved himself a chip off the old block. David, you tweeted the most frustrating part of the debate was how comprehensively deceptive it was. So comprehensively, we saw, as Norm pointed out, a fairly smooth, lawyerly, debate-savvy side of J.D. Vance. We certainly saw some big lies, but comprehensively, I want to zero in on that. Do you think the whole thing was a bunch of crap?
Well, so what we saw was, I guess the best way to say it would be Yale washing MAGA. So you take this sort of MAGA universe that J.D. Vance has inserted himself into perfectly, where he's engaging in exactly the kind of wild insults that dominate MAGA, childless cat ladies and all of this stuff. He makes the right-wing podcast circuit where he pretends to be just like one of the podcast bros, just like everybody else, completely able to viciously insult people, right up there with Donald Trump. Says in an interview, our people hate the right people. And then all of a sudden he comes on to national television and, he's the Yale lawyer, right? And part of it was would the real J.D. Vance please stand up? And he stood up at the very end. So at the very beginning, for 90% of it, he is, look, I'm just your reasonable intellectual populist, and I agree with my opponent a lot, and he agrees with me a lot. We just have these disagreements that are, in good faith, but I'm right. It almost looked for a while like footage from the 2012 presidential debates, where if you remember those, Obama and Romney repeatedly said, I agree with much of what my opponent said. However, it was Lincoln Douglas debates compared to what we normally deal with now. But then at the very end, you can only go so far in Yale washing MAGA. Eventually, it's just got to be pure MAGA. And that's at the very end when he was challenged on the election. And he very clearly called the election results into question again and made it also very clear to MAGA, I'm no Mike Pence. I might be playing civil on TV, but when push comes to shove, I'll throw this whole place on the bonfire for Donald Trump and also for him personally. And so 90% of it was just pure Yale washing. The last 10% was MAGA. And it's one of the reasons why that last 10% has overwhelmed the first 90% in all of the discussions after the debate. That moment was the moment when he just couldn't wear the Yale suit all the way through, right?
Right. Boola boola.
Yeah. Let's give props, though, to J.D. Vance's law school class, which joined together on a Zoom during the debate, joined together to send $10,000 to Springfield to help the Haitians.
Oh, wow.
So the class is basically saying, Usha and J.D., please, we're not like you. But, the interesting thing to me in that debate was that Tim Walz let J.D. Vance Yale wash for the first 90%. And it was clearly a deliberate strategy that the Harris-Walz team had put together. And it, I have to say, perplexed me. I understand why part of the strategy is we don't care if this debate ends up a wash because nobody makes a decision based on the vice president, and we'd rather have them remember the presidential debate. And we'd rather have the message coming out being we're positive, we're inclusive, and that even includes some of these MAGA people. But I thought the strength of Tim Walz, one of the main reasons he was picked, is that he could go after MAGA without appearing to be vicious. They're weird, all of that stuff. Just to pick an example, they are discussing guns. And why Tim Walz didn't say, JD, you said that school shootings are a fact of life. Do you really think that parents and grandparents want to live their lives every day when their kids and grandkids go off to school wondering if they're going to be coming back home? Do you think they should live their lives thinking as they go to school about their escape plans or where they'd have to hide or who they would call? And, I think that missed something. And partly what it missed is now that Biden is no longer the candidate, where a good part of the discussion was he will probably not last another 4 years, and it's Harris, when she was really viewed in a negative light. J.D. Vance, if Trump wins, would be one enlarged heartbeat away from being president and very likely to become the president. And I think you want to shed light on what it would mean if this guy actually took over the reins of power. And they missed that beat. And I think that was a mistake on the part of the Waltz team.
Norm, I totally agree with you. And I guess I'm curious about why you think it was deliberate. I don't know that it was deliberate on the part of the Harris administration. I think that Tim Walz, like many of us, were kind of duped by the civility. The civility was such a novelty. It was so refreshing when those guys would like smile at each other and agree with each other and say, I happen to be in the same position. It was like, oh, we could all exhale for a minute. And I think that Tim Walz, being, from what I can tell, a nice guy, wanted to lean into that, but you can't bring a penknife to a sword fight. And, you can't be a Boy Scout when the country is depending upon you. And I think that he was completely kind of dazzled by the civility that J.D. Vance showed up with. And I was wondering, in fact, who coached him or how he was coached, because I don't think that they showed the Yale nice guy, civil JD guy. What are you going to do if this guy shows up? And I don't know that he prepared for that. And so I totally agree with you. There were missed opportunities where he could have said, don't be fooled by what you see here. This is the 2025 guy. This is the guy who wants, Haitians to be threatened and killed because he continues to say this lie. He didn't do that. And I don't think it was deliberate.
I tend to agree with you, Alisyn. I mean, part of it is an unbelievable Klieg-like moment, and this is not his home base. He's not a normal lawyer and debater, but he had one tart moment where he pushed over the line, and it was the most memorable, as you said, in the debate. That is a damning non-admission. And why why he wasn't prepped for several of those, because as polite and Yale-y as J.D. Vance was, he had easily a half a dozen of, come on, are you kidding us? Kind of moments that Walz did let pass.
There was word that the Vance nice move was just that, a move to rattle Walz. Because if you're preparing to debate MAGA, you spend the whole time preparing to deal with wild insults, crazy lies, etc., which, by the way, is a very hard thing to do. A debate is like litigation in the extent that you're often responding in real time to arguments and points made by the other side. And in my litigation days and in the many debates I've done over the course of my life, the hardest person to debate is the wildly erratic liar and insulter, because it's almost impossible to prep yourself for every conceivable lie. And it's very difficult, honestly, to answer irrationality with rationality. That gets difficult. And so you actually end up leaning a lot on the judge or the jury or the audience to be able to discern the difference between logic and reason and provocation and prevarication. And it's very difficult. So it's very understandable that you would spend all of your time, how do I deal with crazy lies? How do I deal with wild allegations? Filling your mind with all of the different fact checks. And then here comes a normal debater, like a guy who, for the first 90% of the debate, it was like watching an Aspen panel discussion, not the presidential debates we've become used to over the last 9 years. And so I absolutely understand why Walz would kind of be flummoxed by that. But the one thing that I don't understand is, why didn't he have a coherent answer about the Tiananmen Square stuff? Why can't you just say, look, I was there after, not before. I'm a knucklehead. I misspoke. I do that sometimes, and I'm sorry.
Shorter, the better.
And then pivot immediately. As long as we're talking about lies, let's talk about lies. Yeah.
It's now time to take a moment for our sidebar feature, which explains some of the issues that are prominent in the news. Today's feature is about the Constitution's Confrontation Clause, a fundamental right in the Sixth Amendment that ensures a criminal defendant's ability to confront the witnesses against her. To explain the clause, we welcome the one and only, the great and powerful Jane Lynch. Jane is an incredibly talented actress, author, singer, and comedian with more than 200 acting credits to her name. She starred as the delightfully devious Sue Sylvester on the hit TV series Glee, as Sophie Lennon on The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, a fantastic star turn that I recommend for all as Saz Pataki on Only Murders in the Building, and many, many more. She's also starred in films such as Wreck-It Ralph, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, and of course her unforgettable roles in Christopher Guest's ensemble comedies like Best in Show. So I give you Jane Lynch on the Constitution's Confrontation Clause.
The right to confront witnesses derives from the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which states, "In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to be confronted with the witnesses against him." This provision is known as the Confrontation Clause, and it gives a criminal defendant the power to force the government's witnesses to appear in person at trial and be subject to cross-examination. The Confrontation Clause is a procedural right that ultimately is designed to promote the reliability of evidence. The provision doesn't itself require that the evidence be reliable. Rather, it requires that the evidence's reliability be put to the test of cross-examination of the witness by the defendant. The clause is generally satisfied when the defense is given a full and fair opportunity to probe and expose infirmities in a witness's testimony through cross-examination. A full and fair opportunity to cross-examine generally guarantees the defendant a face-to-face meeting with witnesses appearing before the trier of fact, on the theory that it's more difficult to tell a lie about a person to his face than behind his back. The right to confront one's accuser has long existed in the English and Roman legal traditions. For example, English common law developed the right of confrontation in the early 17th century in response to the use of written deposition testimony derived from secret government interrogations. The purpose of this legal right is to protect the defendant from illegitimate or unsubstantiated statements made against them. It further allows jurors to consider the witness's credibility under active scrutiny from the defense. Confrontation Clause protections overlap with other rules against the use of out-of-court statements, known in the law as hearsay. However, the Confrontation Clause may preclude evidence that would otherwise be permitted under hearsay rules. For example, statements of a co-conspirator are a classic hearsay exception, and so the police could testify that a conspirator confessed to a crime and implicated a defendant. However, under the Confrontation Clause, the co-conspirator would be required to testify at trial and be subject to cross-examination. There are, however, notable exceptions to the right to confrontation. In cases where the defendant prevents the witness from appearing in court for the purpose of suppressing their testimony, by intimidation, for example, the defendant is considered to have waived their right to confrontation. Furthermore, since the mid-2000s, the Supreme Court has concluded that only testimonial statements, which are those made to law enforcement in a setting indicating they will likely be used as trial evidence, are subject to the Confrontation Clause. Thus, for example, when a person speaks to law enforcement to assist in resolving an emergency, as when she makes a 911 call, such statements are not considered testimonial and are not subject to the Confrontation Clause. For Talking Feds, I'm Jane Lynch.
Thank you, Jane Lynch, for that explanation. Currently, Jane is hosting the beloved NBC game show Weakest Link. The show returns with a new season on Tuesday, April 2nd on NBC. And you can also follow Jane and all her newest projects on Instagram and Threads at Jane Lynch Official. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we hop into the beer cooler to ask the question, to IPA or not IPA? The India Pale Ale has become synonymous with the word hoppy. And it's that hoppiness that's created a bittersweet relationship with IPAs that has divided beer lovers across the world into two categories. Those who love this style of the pale ale for its full flavored bite with flavors of lemon and pine needle, plus typically higher alcohol content. And then those who prefer a little less sharpness with each sip. So what gives IPAs that signature bite? Well, there's another abbreviation you should know, IBU. which stands for International Bitterness Units. The higher the IBU, the more bitter the beer. Luckily, at Total Wine & More, we carry an array of IPAs that offer up a huge range of hoppiness. We've all been bitten by a hoppy IPA in our past. Swing by your local Total Wine & More and let our guides find you an IPA that's more YOU. So find what you love and love what you find. Only at Total Wine & More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate. Let's move on to the Harris campaign. Trump lied, which is what we've been talking about, is sort of an old and tired headline by now, if a galling and important one. I think the sort of freshest and biggest political news of the week was Liz Cheney arm in arm with Kamala Harris on the campaign trail. I found the images sort of breathtaking and historic. I think we'll see that little snapshot of the two of them in history books. But of course, I'm following the campaign closely, so a version of the same question. There's now going to be a Harris commercial in battleground states featuring Cheney. But basically, has anyone who's moved by the vision of the two together already decided whom they're voting for?
I mean, I thought it was a stunning moment. And I repeat frequently what Liz said a while ago, which is, you can live through bad policies. You can't live through the demise of democracy. And I think that is such a powerful point to conservatives. One of the things that struck me, though, as I watched her was, where is George W. Bush? Where is Condi Rice? Where is John Kelly? Where are some of these people? For George W. Bush, if you care about the future of a Republican Party, which has been a core part of your identity for your entire life, how can you just sit back and watch it be destroyed? And the same with Condi. If you're a John Kelly who has said over and over again that this man is completely unfit to be president and would be a danger to the society, McMaster the same, how can you not then endorse his opponent to keep him out of the White House? But with all of that, we're still, let's turn the focus where it needs to be, which is we're looking at a marginal group of voters who could make the difference in the swing states. And it's partly dependent on the turnout of the bases, but it's dependent on the college-educated suburban Republican and independent voters. And that's where I think a Liz Cheney commercial could make a difference. You're going to make a difference if you can come out with some commercials, as we've seen with one very powerful one about what a danger Donald Trump is, to have people thinking, even if they're Republicans, about whether they can vote for this guy. But then you come back with, I'm going to be inclusive and look at kind of the support that I've got. So it could be very effective. And it would be more effective if we had a steady stream of prominent Republicans who joined this bandwagon.
I like what you're saying, and I think that I hadn't thought about the George W. Bush, because I just assume that he wants out of this mud pile. But who do you think would be swayed at this point by George W. Bush?
Well, I think what we need, Alisyn, is a continuing permission structure for Republicans to vote against their own party, which is not something that they would normally do. And for many of them to vote for candidates who will bring policies. I don't think the Harris policies are going to be crazy left. I think they're going to be center left. I think that's what she's been saying, and I believe that. And besides, they'd be constrained by the nature of the political system. But it's still difficult if you think that their policies are not great policies. And if you have been brought up as a Republican to vote Republican, to go to the other side. And that's where Liz saying, I've never voted for a Democrat in my life, but I think helps.
My neighborhood is 85% Republican. Like, I live in red America. The piggy bank of the GOP in the South is my county. And so I think of two effects that you have. So the Cheney effect is the permission structure for people who are really just livid at MAGA. So for me, I voted third party in 2016 and 2020. So I wrote in Mitt Romney. I've voted for Mitt Romney more than Mitt Romney has voted for Mitt Romney. So, but then after 2020, everything, in my view, the issues changed. You have January 6th, you have Ukraine war, you have a very dangerous time in the world, and the last thing we need is an unstable human being in the White House. And so for me, it raised the issue stakes. And so I'm voting for Harris in 2024. There are Republicans who are making that step. And I think that Cheney gives a permission structure for Republicans who make that step. Then there's another group of people like the Mike Pences who are saying, I'm not voting for either one. And that's creating a permission structure for a step for a lot of MAGA voters who voted in 2020 to step out of it in 2024. And so I see a value in both approaches. My friend Sarah Longwell started this group, Republicans Against Trump. And the message was very simple. It wasn't vote for the Democrat. It was just don't vote for Trump. And I think there's a lot of people who are in this position where I don't agree with the Democrats. They can't, their minds just can't get there. They have been a partisan Republican for a long time. And to unsympathetic Democrats, I often say, under what circumstances will you vote for a pro-life candidate, for example? When would you do that? And then if they think about it for a while, they'll go, oh, I don't know when I would do that. And so I think there are two kinds of permission structures being created, the Mike Pence permission structure and the Liz Cheney. And I think they're both valuable. And one of my least favorite things in life online is the battle over who's the purest and best never Trumper. Right. Like my never Trumpism is the best never Trumpism. I'm just glad when anyone who is a lifelong Republican says I'm not on this train. And if someone votes for Harris, that's what I'm doing, great. If someone votes for third party, American Solidarity Party, great. But if you're a traditional Republican who would have voted for Trump and you're not doing that anymore, then I think you're recognized the moment. And we have to have permission structures for both of these paths.
At her rally in Flint and in Wisconsin, there's the very open kind of tug of war over who is more working class. But Harris emphasized that she remains the underdog in the presidential race. It's going to be a very tight race until the very end. And Trump, of course, always wants to cast himself as the overdog, of course we're going to win, etc. Do you think those are the smart strategies for both of them?
I don't think they could adopt the other one. I don't think it's in their natures. I don't think Kamala Harris is in a position where she could be like, I know we're going to win this. I don't think that would be well received. And I don't know Donald Trump to, as we know, ever admit any possible weakness or loss or chink in the armor. So that's not in his nature. So I don't think that they have any choice. I thought, just because you were reminding me of when she was in Flint, I'm just going to add this aside. It's totally off topic, but I thought it was fun. I was on the air yesterday when Kamala Harris was speaking in Detroit, actually, and she wanted to talk about the port workers' strike. And then Joe Biden surprised everybody by coming out to the press briefing room and stepping on her right as she was speaking. We were about to take her live. They were literally in my ear like, Alisyn, wrap it up. We're going to Kamala live. She's in Detroit. She's talking about and they're going, wait, don't do that. Hold on. Here comes President Biden. And so we had to pivot, and he came out to the press briefing room, which has never happened in his entire presidency. And everybody was surprised. And we just thought, are their communications teams not speaking to each other to know that he just stole all her thunder?
And it was even better, right? Everyone screams at him, are you sorry about it? Blah, blah. And he turned around and said, I'm back.
Yeah.
It was great.
But, I think everyone's haunted by 2016. Because remember, in 2016, people were so confident that Hillary was going to win. There was this big pilgrimage to the graves of the suffragettes. And there was like this, I will never forget, the whole day was this triumphalism, first woman president. And then what was it, around 7 p.m., 8 p.m.? It was like, wait a minute, hold on, hold the phone. It's not going the way we thought it was going to go. And then I think that both the Biden campaign in 2020, and then I think Democrats are also haunted by the fact they thought it'd be a bigger landslide in 2020 than it was. And so, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. This messaging that says you got every last breathing Harris voter had better get to the polls, I think is through hard-earned experience. And Alisyn's right, MAGA thrives on triumphalism. It thrives on this sort of sense of inevitability and hidden power. and we're going to show you. So I think they're both doing exactly the messaging that is necessary for their respective bases.
So in the no good deed goes unpunished category, for decades where I was doing commentary and analysis of elections, I wouldn't give money to any campaign. Now I give a little bit of money and I get 50 texts and 20 phone calls a day, and they all have the same theme. I didn't want to bother you, but I've got really bad news. Right, I'm down by 3 points, and please send me $5. And it doesn't matter whether they're ahead by 20 points or actually are down, but it's the theme. And clearly it must work. But I think, first, Alisyn and David are right that you cannot get complacent, but it's also a question, which is a serious one for Harris. Can you get your base out? Will the enthusiasm that we've seen since Harris became the candidate, what we see visibly on the ground with all these lines for her rallies, compared to Trump now actually going to high school gyms and still seeing people leave, and him saying, you think they're leaving, but they're not really. They're just off going to the bathroom. But does that translate into people turning out? And we know she's still got problems with a pretty wide range of Hispanic voters, with young African-American voters. It's not clear that all the young voters, including with the Gaza issue and the Middle East, which could, let's face it, explode into something even more before the election is over, are going to be out there voting for her. You need to keep the focus on, this is close. I need every single voter to turn out, no matter what happens out there. One other thing we need to at least raise. Hurricane Helene is going to cause some issues with voting. It'll cause issues on both sides. Asheville and its county are in North Carolina are strongly blue. In a state that might be extremely closely divided, if they can't get their act together, be back and be able to vote, could make the difference. But there are plenty of other rural areas that are red that are going to be in trouble too. We have another tropical storm that will turn into a hurricane within the next week, going through Florida and heading to the Gulf. And it wouldn't be surprising if there's another one after that. For all of this and getting people mobilized, if you don't have the resources to be able to get things back on track and enable them to vote, and if we don't have the ability to have vote by mail or boxes where people can't go to polling places because they don't exist, we could have an election that's kind of thrown into very different territory. We came very close to having that in 2018 when Hurricane Michael, which became the first Category 5 hurricane to hit the Gulf Coast in 100 years, it won't be the last, went up to the panhandle of Florida and barely missed Pensacola. If it had hit Pensacola, we wouldn't have Governor DeSantis, we wouldn't have Senator Scott. So there's a lot of other stuff out there in October that we have to keep an eye on, and it's another reason why you want to keep your pedal to the metal.
And every element of chaos that injects becomes an opportunity for challenge. Something's been irregular, feeds into the Trump playbook. Okay, I really want to spend at least a minute with the big news from Jack Smith. The country has been an apparent, battle for over a year that Trump's been winning, keeping facts from the public eye, right? Oh, we need a trial. No way we're going to have, let's have a mini trial. And that's not going to happen. And now we have a 180-page chapter and verse with all the greatest hits and some really incendiary more than sort of allegations, real documentation of the nasty stuff and new nasty stuff. Now, everyone was focused on it, and yet in the past, big things have happened, and it turned out that Trump was able to get past them, and it didn't really have an impact. So October surprise that matters, or, not such a big deal now that the cat is actually out of the bag. Thoughts?
I think that it serves to remind people of what January 6th was like. I mean, I don't think it's surprising. It wasn't new to me that Trump said, so what, when told that, Mike Pence had to be in a safe location, hurried to a safe location. And he said, so what? I mean, so what are kind of the defining words of Donald Trump's humanitarian policy. And so it just reminded me, it brought back some of those feelings of, oh, right, there were 3 hours where nothing happened. Oh, 140 more police officers were brutalized, some with grievous injuries. And so, I mean, if you're asking, does it move the needle? I doubt it. I don't know the answer, but I had like a visceral reaction to reading the takeaways from it of how awful that was.
My thought is October surprises can mainly hurt Democrats, not Trump.
Interesting. Explain.
What more is Trump going to do in October than he did between November and January of 2020 and 2021? Like, he would literally have to walk out there and shoot somebody. So based on everything that we've known about Trump, an October surprise to introduce something of greater magnitude than all of that would have to be the doozy of all doozies, right? So that's not realistic. However, if you go back again to the things that haunt Democrats about 2016, remember the Comey letter. So the Comey letter, in my view, cost Hillary Clinton the presidency, because here's the reality of the current moment. Normal political rules apply to every politician not named Donald Trump. So a scandal will hurt another politician. I mean, think about how much DeSantis was harmed by the idea that he ate pudding with his fingers once.
That is gross.
That's disgusting.
I mean,
I stand by that.
I've done that, like to get the last bit out of the pudding cup. I mean, come on, who hasn't done that?
I think Donald Trump has.
But the idea that like pudding fingers or whatever, that's not a gaffe. That's just a kind of a weird factoid. And things like that actually harm other politicians. You'll see like Mark Robinson in North Carolina. So Mark Robinson, as horrible as he is, and he's horrible. He's horrible with a capital H. He hasn't done the stuff Trump's done. He was on porn message boards. Trump's been found liable for sex abuse. I mean, these are not the same thing. And yet Robinson's support in North Carolina is collapsing and Trump's support in North Carolina is holding. So the rule is there are no rules that apply to Trump and all the rules apply to everybody else. So that's why I think October surprises are a one-way ratchet against the Democrats. Again, if it's a negative October surprise for them.
The next David French book. Norm, last word to you.
I would echo that in part because the incumbent administration is almost always going to get blamed for turmoil of any sort that's out there. And that includes what might happen in the world, in the Middle East, in Ukraine. But there's another element of this. When the Comey letter came out, it was banner headlines that dominated. This one, meh. Now, part of that is you're trying to digest 165 pages of all kinds of stuff. One of the things that's key about this is every single incriminating witness, and not just witness, every piece of evidence is from a Republican. This is not coming from Democrats.
More than a Republican, an insider. Yeah.
Insiders. I hope it serves, first of all, to get Merrick Garland and Jack Smith to move against some of the other players who are unindicted co-conspirators who ought to be indicted. And that includes some members of Congress, a former chief of staff, and others. But given that it is not making those banner headlines, it's not going to make a difference. Not that it would ever make a difference with the Trump voters. And, David's right there, I actually would take it to the next level. It's not just if he shot somebody in broad daylight on Fifth Avenue that he wouldn't lose a vote. He could take an AR-15 and mow down the entire avenue, and his voters aren't going to be moved. The question is whether you can motivate a Democratic base with even more of an understanding of how much of a monster is Trump and what a danger it is to our democracy and how this could be the last election, period. And at the same time, get some of those persuadable voters either to say, I got to vote for Harris, or I got to not vote for Trump. And maybe at the margins, it'll make a small difference, not the difference we need. Maybe it'll make a little difference with the Supreme Court, because when this comes back, one of the things in that filing is it makes, I think, a very strong case for a whole set of terrible, incriminating actions that by no stretch of the imagination of anybody except Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas could be considered even at the periphery of an official act. So if he loses, you would hope that they'd be able to move forward forthwith with a prosecution despite what I think was an outrageous, ahistorical, anti-constitutional ruling on presidential immunity.
Or at least with all deliberate speed. Okay, we are out of time. We just got a minute left for Talking 5. Our question today that we all have to answer in 5 words or fewer. What is J.D. Vance's campaign slogan in 2028?
This time, I'm normal. Because MAGA without Trump just blows up. So he's got to switch gears, man.
Mine is, cats are safe with me.
Okay, 5. Never let facts get in the way. Sorry. So
Interfere.
Good.
Interfere.
Good.
Yeah, and I'm going with only verified liar in race. Thank you so much, Alisyn, David, and Norm. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at TalkingFedsPod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds is a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mahendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. This podcast is dedicated to the memory of Tim Lewis. Talking Feds is a production of Dolito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later. Now it's time for a new section of the show, Talking Back. It's a special segment featuring a question of the week that we've crowdsourced from our Patreon members. If you like the work we're doing at Talking Feds, joining our Patreon is the best way to support the show. Our Patreon link is in the episode description. And hey, it only costs $5 to join.
Harry, this is Jan from Manila. On November 5th, when Donald Trump loses the election, he will just be a citizen and no longer a candidate. Will he be gagged so he can no longer threaten the district attorney and can no longer threaten the judges? Because he is certainly not running for office at like 90 years old. Inquiring minds from all over the world want to know.
First, you can't assume that he won't be running for office in 2028. And indeed, there's some ways of thinking about what he's doing that have to do with remaining the sort of top dog in the Republican Party and having that measure of control. But in any event, his loss as a candidate won't change in very large part the relationship that the courts now have with him. It's already the case in New York. This would be the case elsewhere for any prosecutions that go forward, asterisk, I'll get to that in a moment, that the interest served by a gag order, not intimidating witnesses, and the integrity of the trial process could still be vindicated, as indeed they are right now in New York, by a limited gag order. Now, I do think it's true that the sort of First Amendment interests on the other side seem more weighty with him running for president, because there's also the whole element of the public's right to know. But technically, that's kind of atmospheric. In other words, the question for the courts is whether those interests that I just delineated keeping witness intimidation at a minimum and safeguarding the integrity of the process. Where those exist in sufficient supply, you can impose a gag order, a limited gag order, and it's not really even a First Amendment analysis because the interests are different from the interests that the government may have in limiting speech. So the basic answer is yes, he can be gagged, but he can be gagged today. And now back to the asterisk, of course, if he is elected, the federal cases go away, and he will do what he can to make other cases go away. But to the extent they don't, the interest in a limited gag order remains. So that when these cases revive, if he manages to mothball them, these are the state ones, the federal ones, he will just completely smother and end. The interests remain whatever his position is. Thanks, Jan. To submit a question for next week's show, join our Patreon. The link is in the episode's description.